He thought he was just visiting his wife's grave like he did every year, but this time someone was already there. A young man who turned and said, "She was my mother." That one sentence changed everything. This is a story about a secret son, a lost letter, and the kind of love that shows up when it's almost too late. Stick around, because what happens next will break your heart, and then put it back together. Dear friend, what you're about to experience is not just a story, it's a deeply human journey about lost resilience, and the quiet, unexpected ways love finds us when we need it most. If this is your first time here, I invite you to drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing your voice. And if you're someone who believes in second chances and the hidden strength of ordinary people, and in stories that stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing and tapping the bell icon. We share moments that matter. Thank you for being part of this one. Now let's begin. Of all the days in the year, October 9th always hit Elliot Granger the hardest. Rain slicked the pavement of Lakeview Memorial Cemetery in Seattle. The kind of rain that soaked not just skin but memory. Heavy, cold, a whisper of the past in every drop. Elliot stepped out of his matte black Range Rover, his expensive shoes splashing against wet leaves as he walked toward the headstone that had become his private altar. Clara Granger, his wife, his only softness in a world of steel and skyscrapers. It had been 8 years since she passed, and still, Elliot came back on this day every year without fail. Not as the ruthless CEO whose name was etched into Fortune magazine covers and downtown high-rises, but as a man with no one left to call him by his first name in the quiet. He carried a bouquet of white camellias, Clara's favorite. But this year, something was different. There was someone already standing at her grave. A young man, barely 20, with a lean frame soaked through from the rain. He wore a dark denim jacket frayed at the sleeves, and his hands were clenched deep in his pockets. But it was his eyes that stopped Elliot cold. Eyes that mirrored something familiar. Something he couldn't name yet, but felt in his bones. Elliot approached, heart knocking against his ribs. "Do you know her?" he asked, voice low. The young man didn't look away from the headstone. He just said softly, "She was my mother." The words shattered Elliot's world like glass. He froze. Somewhere between breath and disbelief, a thought slashed through him. What did he say? "What did you say?" He whispered again, this time louder. "She was my mother," the boy repeated, finally turning toward him. "And if what she told me is true, then you're my father." That moment right there rewrote Elliot's entire understanding of his past. Because Clara never told him she had a son, never told him she had his son. And now that son was standing here at her grave, soaked in grief and rain, not asking for anything, just existing in a truth Elliot didn't even know he'd been denied. He staggered back a step, staring. His heart raced. His lips parted, but no words came. This wasn't some corporate merger. There was no deal to negotiate, no contract to edit. This was real, raw, and irreversible. The boy? Micah looked just like Clara when she was young. The same fire in his jaw, the same quiet storm in his voice. "I didn't know," Elliot finally said, his voice trembling. "She never told me." Micah's stare didn't soften. She had her reasons. The words hung heavy between them. Not angry, but laced with something worse, restraint. The kind of pain that's been buried so long it's grown teeth. Elliot wanted to scream. At himself, at Clara, at time. How could she not have told him? How could a child, his child, have grown up without a father, without even knowing he existed? And yet, what crushed him most wasn't the betrayal. It was that the boy hadn't come to find him. Micah wasn't here to seek a relationship. He had come to mourn, alone, like he had always been. They stood there in silence, rain dripping from their shoulders as Clara's name, carved into marble, stared back at both of them. For Elliot, it was a moment that stripped away everything: his titles, his bank accounts, his reputation. He was a man left with only questions and no defense. He asked again, more desperate this time, "Why didn't she tell me Micah didn't answer?" He just shook his head, then turned to leave. No goodbye, no demand, just a quiet retreat into the rain, like he had said all he'd come to say. Elliot wanted to stop him, run after him, shout something that would keep him there, but he didn't even know the boy's name. In that instant, the ache inside him changed shape. It was no longer just grief for Clara. It was regret so thick it tasted like iron. He had built towers across Seattle, but he couldn't even hold on to the only thing that ever truly mattered. He fell to his knees at Clara's grave, camellias slipping from his hand. "I could have been there," he whispered, choked. "I would have been there." But the wind didn't answer. People often say grief gets easier with time, that the sharp edges dull, but they don't tell you how new grief you never saw coming can knock the breath out of you even harder than the first time. Elliot had believed he'd lost everything the day Clara died. He was wrong. What he lost was a life he never even got the chance to live. It's easy to sit atop an empire and believe you understand pain, but nothing, not bankruptcy, not business betrayal, not even death, can compare to realizing you missed the most sacred moments of your child's life simply because you didn't know they existed. Micah was real, and he was gone again. In that graveyard, Elliot Granger, one of the most powerful men in the Pacific Northwest, was just a man kneeling in the rain, begging a grave for answers. The question now wasn't just how Clara had kept this secret, but whether there was still a chance to rebuild something from it. Anything. Even a conversation. Because this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Some stories begin with love, some with loss. But the stories that shape us most, they start when truth arrives too late. And that's where we go next, to a time when Clara Granger made the most impossible choice a woman can make to raise a child alone, in silence, away from the man she once loved more than anything. Before Micah ever stood in the rain at Clara's grave, before Elliot's world cracked open with 5 simple words. She was my mother. There was another story. One told in shadows and silence. A story of sacrifice, not shouted but swallowed. Clara Granger had once been light incarnate. At Reed College in Portland, she studied literature and journalism, and her words had this rare kind of rhythm, effortless but urgent. Elliot remembered how she would walk into a room, a notebook under one arm, and talk about changing the world like it was as easy as breathing. She believed in stories, in their power to rebuild or destroy, but Clara disappeared from his life just 2 months after graduation. No calls, no forwarding address, just gone. He thought she'd grown tired of his ambition, of the long nights he spent building the foundation of Granger Holdings. She had always said she feared being a footnote in someone else's legacy. What Elliot never knew was that Clara left not because she stopped loving him, but because she was scared that love alone wouldn't be enough. When Clara discovered she was pregnant, she wrote a letter. Not a short note, not a guilt-ridden confession, but a full, trembling-hearted letter that told the whole truth. She never mailed it. She kept it in a box beneath her bed, wrapped in fabric that smelled faintly of lavender and ink. The words were there. She just never let them reach him. She feared that Elliot, caught in the gears of empire building, would either feel trapped or try to fix her life with money, not love. And Clara, fiercely independent, breathtakingly proud, couldn't live with either. So she moved back to her hometown in Eugene, Oregon, into a small rental above a bakery. She got a part-time job at the local newspaper freelanced, where she could, and gave birth to Micah on a cold March morning, with only her childhood best friend Lena at her side. But things got harder. When Micah was 4, Clara began experiencing muscle fatigue and frequent fevers. After months of testing, she was diagnosed with lupus. It was the kind that didn't just flare, it ravaged. She kept working, kept writing, kept pretending. But slowly, the world she had imagined for herself and her son began to shrink. She never told Micah who his father was. "He was someone I loved very much," she'd say. And when Micah asked why he wasn't around, Clara would smile sadly and say, "Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let someone go before they realize they're not ready to stay." Lena begged her to reach out to Elliot, but Clara always refused. "I don't want Micah to become someone's moral obligation," she said once sitting at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she stirred her tea. "I want him to be someone's choice." It was a noble sentiment. It was also a sentence. Micah grew up not poor, but precarious. Clara gave him love in abundant stories at bedtime, and courage in every note she left in his school lunches. But she couldn't give him a father. She couldn't give him the one thing she feared would come at too high a cost: recognition. The truth was, she had saved Elliot's number on a torn scrap of paper in her drawer for years. On nights when the pain got bad, or when Micah cried himself to sleep because other kids had dads and he didn't, she'd sit on the couch phone, in hand thumb hovering over the number. And then she'd put it back. Not out of spite, but fear. Fear of what Elliot might say, fear of what he wouldn't. There are some wounds that fester, not because of what's done, but because of what's left undone. Clara's illness worsened when Micah turned 15. By 16, he was the one refilling her prescriptions, helping her up the stairs, learning how to cook things that wouldn't upset her stomach. She tried to shield him from the reality, but Micah saw. He always saw. On her last birthday, Clara wrote a second letter, this time addressed to Micah. She put it in an envelope with Elliot's name and business card, tucked it under her pillow, and told Lena, "If anything happens, give this to him. He'll need it more than I will." But grief changes people. Lena couldn't bring herself to hand over the letter. Not right away. She watched Micah navigate the world alone, graduating high school, working part-time jobs, applying to community college, clutching his mother's memory like it was both a weapon and a wound. It wasn't until Lena saw Micah begin to crumble under the weight of what he didn't know that she finally handed him the envelope. He read Clara's words on a rainy evening, seated at the foot of his bed, her perfume long faded, but somehow still present on the page. The letter didn't plead, it didn't justify. It simply told him the truth: "I didn't tell your father because I wanted to be brave." But sometimes love and fear wear the same face. Micah wept until dawn. He didn't go to Elliot for answers. He went to her grave. Because that's where he'd always gone when life felt too heavy. Because that's where the silence felt honest. When Elliot found him there, it wasn't fate. It wasn't coincidence. It was the story coming full circle, finally ready to be heard. Some may question Clara's choice, but here's the truth. Love doesn't always look like showing up. Sometimes it looks like stepping away so that someone else can become who they were meant to be, even if it means becoming it alone. And sometimes the ones who leave do so not out of weakness, but out of a strength so quiet it gets mistaken for abandonment. The lesson isn't simple. It never is, but maybe it's this: you can't rewrite the past, but you can choose what pieces of it to carry forward and how to hold them. Micah did carry it forward, and Elliot, left holding grief he didn't know he'd earned, was about to find out what it meant to try. Not to fix, not to rescue, but to begin again, one broken conversation at a time. Micah didn't answer Elliot's calls for weeks. After the graveside revelation, he returned to his routine in Beacon Hill, early shifts at the auto shop, night classes at the local college, evenings spent alone in his tiny studio apartment above a cafe. Life was simple, predictable, and his. That mattered, because for so long Micah's life had felt borrowed, from his mother's bravery, from other people's kindness. He had carved out his identity with no blueprint, no inheritance, no name but his own. And now, suddenly, there was this man, this millionaire, this stranger offering him dinners in Skyline restaurants and tickets to Mariners games like they were keys to a world Micah never asked to enter. Elliot tried, really tried. He sent messages like "just checking in," or "would love to talk when you're ready." He even showed up once at the auto shop, standing awkwardly in a suit between tire stacks, asking if Micah wanted to grab lunch. Micah said no, because what he couldn't say was this: he didn't want a father who was only present now that it was convenient. He didn't want to feel like a project. He didn't want guilt-wrapped generosity. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was to matter, without needing to be impressive or broken or extraordinary. Elliot, for his part, wasn't trying to buy his son, but he didn't know any other language. His whole life had been negotiations, transactions, solutions. When a problem arose, he fixed it. If something was lost, he replaced it. If someone was upset, he smoothed it over. But Micah wasn't a client. He was a wound that couldn't be managed. The truth hit Elliot hardest one night when he called and left a voicemail trying again. "It's just dinner," he said. "I'd like to hear how you're doing." No pressure. Micah never responded, but then something changed. It was early November. Rain again. Micah had just gotten off work and was riding his motorcycle through Madison Park when a car ran a red light. The impact was brutal. His bike was totaled. His ribs were cracked. His right wrist shattered. He woke up in a hospital bed, tubes in his arm, pain slicing through every breath, and Elliot sitting beside him asleep in a chair, his coat draped over the edge of the bed. Micah blinked, swallowed. "What are you doing here?" he asked, voice hoarse. Elliot woke with a start, eyes red from fatigue. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned forward and reached for Micah's hand. "You scared the hell out of me," he whispered. Micah looked away. "Don't you have meetings? A company to run?" Elliot smiled a little brokenly. "I canceled a merger meeting with a group from Tokyo." Micah frowned. "That deal was worth what 100 million nine figures," Elliot replied quietly. "But you're worth more." It wasn't a line. It wasn't a pitch. It was a father realizing, maybe for the first time, that there were things in life you couldn't schedule, spin, or salvage once they were gone. Micah didn't say much in response, but the walls began to crack. Recovery took weeks. Elliot showed up every day, not with gifts, but with groceries, books, silences that weren't filled with apologies but shared air. They watched basketball, argued over old rock bands. Sometimes they sat and said nothing at all, and that somehow mattered most. Because Micah began to understand something no one had ever told him: showing up wasn't about words. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about presence, repetition, quiet loyalty. One morning, over a breakfast of hospital eggs and dry toast, Micah finally asked, "Why didn't you ever look for her?" Elliot didn't flinch. He looked down at his hands. "I did, a few times. But I was busy. I let time pass. I thought maybe she was better off without me." He looked up. Turns out she wasn't the only one who disappeared. Micah nodded. Then, with more sadness than anger, he said, "You can't just show up now and expect me to want a dad." "I know." Micah paused. "But you can be something." That was the beginning. They didn't define it, didn't rush it. But slowly, Elliot started being invited once to a physical therapy session, once to a class presentation Micah gave on consumer psychology. Later, to Sunday dinner at Lena's. Micah never called him Dad, but he stopped calling him Elliot too. Just, hey. And Elliot cherished every one, because relationships, especially ones born from absence, don't bloom overnight. They grow in quiet moments, not grand gestures, in showing up to help change a tire, in remembering how he likes his coffee, in not leaving even when it's easier to walk away. And Micah, for all his guardedness, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, people could change. Not because they were forced to, but because they chose to, repeatedly. The lesson came not in a rush, but slowly. Micah was not someone to be bought. He was someone to be known. And Elliot had to learn that dignity doesn't bend under wealth. It demands presence, not pity. They were far from healed, but they were moving forward. And one afternoon, as the winter sun dipped behind the Olympic Mountains, Elliot asked Micah if he'd be willing to visit his home. Just for a weekend, no pressure. Micah agreed, which led them into the space Elliot had spent years building, but never truly lived in, a glass-walled house on Queen Anne Hill, filled with light echoes, and finally a reason to open the door. And that weekend something happened that neither of them expected. Something that would change not just the rhythm of their relationship, but its very meaning. Something as ordinary as a shared meal, and as extraordinary as a legacy redefined. The first weekend Micah spent at Elliot's house was quiet, tentative, and strangely comforting. The home, perched high above Seattle's Queen Anne Hill, was a marvel of glass and steel walls that breathed in the sky floors that reflected the clouds. But for all its beauty, it had always felt cold. Empty, until now. Micah arrived with nothing but a duffel bag and a guarded expression. Elliot met him at the door with 2 mugs of coffee and said, "House rule, no talking business before noon." Micah smirked. "What if I don't talk at all?" Elliot handed him the mug. "Then I guess we just drink." That first night they made dinner together. Not fancy. Just grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, a bottle of wine for Elliot, iced tea for Micah. They moved around each other in the kitchen like 2 people learning a new language, choppy, careful, but willing. After dinner, they sat in the living room. Elliot pulled out an old photo album he hadn't opened in years. Clara took this in college, he said, showing Micah a picture of a younger version of himself, arms around a woman whose smile looked achingly familiar. She made everything brighter. Micah didn't say much, but he looked, really looked. And something softened in his posture. The next morning, they walked Elliot's dog Ruby along Cary Park. As the city stretched below them, Elliot asked, "Have you thought about what you want to do long term?" Micah shrugged. "I like working with my hands. I like helping people. I just don't want to be handed anything I didn't earn." That sentence stayed with Elliot. Back at the house, he showed Micah something he hadn't shared with anyone else, plans for a foundation in Clara's name. The Clara Granger Foundation. Its mission to support single parents pursuing education, especially young mothers with dreams bigger than their resources. Elliot's voice wavered as he explained it. "I never got the chance to support her when she needed it, but maybe I can support others like her now." He asked Micah to be involved not as a figurehead but as co-director, to shape the vision, to make it real. Micah hesitated. "You sure you want to tie your name to a mechanic with no degree?" "I'm not tying it to a mechanic," Elliot said. "I'm tying it to Clara's son." That night, Micah sat alone in the guest room, turning the proposal over in his hands. It wasn't just about a job. It was about legacy, about taking something painful and making it meaningful. He accepted. The weeks that followed became routine. Foundation meetings in the morning. Afternoons volunteering with grant applicants. Sundays filled with barbecues, books, and banter. Lena visited often, bringing old journals Clara had written entries filled with hope, sorrow, and dreams she never got to live out. One passage struck Micah so deeply he read it aloud at dinner one night. "If my son ever finds his father, I hope it isn't too late for both of them to forgive life for its strange timing." There was a pause at the table. Then Elliot reached out, placed his hand over Micah's, and said, "It's not too late, not anymore." Even the board of Granger Holdings began to notice changes in Elliot. He missed fewer family moments, stepped back from aggressive expansions, and talked more about impact than profit. Some called it sentiment. Others called it distraction. Elliot called it clarity. When a high-profile investor questioned the necessity of the Clara Foundation, Elliot looked him straight in the eye and said, "If we can build towers, we can build bridges too. And this one starts with her name." Micah saw that moment, and for the first time he believed his father wasn't just trying, he was transforming. The biggest shift, though, came not in a boardroom but at the dinner table. One night, Lena brought over a box Clara had left in storage. Inside were childhood drawings, letters never mailed, and a video grainy handheld but unmistakably her. In it, Clara holds a toddler Micah on her hip and speaks directly to the camera. "Maybe one day you'll meet him," she says softly. "And maybe by then he'll be someone who knows that love doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to show up." Micah wept as the video played, and Elliot sat beside him, silent, steady, holding the weight of all the years he'd missed and all the ones he refused to miss moving forward. Some bridges are built in contracts and trusts. Others are built in chicken dinners, long walks, and old videos. But all of them require the same materials, vulnerability, patience, and the willingness to show up even when you don't know how to begin. As spring approached and the first scholarship applications for the Clara Granger Foundation began to roll, in something else was quietly blooming trust. Not perfect, not complete, but rooted. And as Elliot watched Micah stand before a room of donors sharing his mother's story with clear eyes and a steady voice, he felt something settle inside him. The past would never be clean, but the future didn't have to carry its dust, which made what happened next all the more unexpected. Because just when they thought the hard part was over, life had one more letter to deliver. One that had been written years ago, lost in a box and now found again, just in time to be read aloud at a rehearsal dinner on the other side of the world. The wedding was small by design but grand in meaning. Micah and Ella chose the Amalfi Coast not for luxury, but for beauty, quiet, honest beauty. The kind Clara had once written about in her journals, describing places she'd never seen but always imagined. The ceremony took place under soft Italian sunlight, with cliffs behind them, and the sea stretching like a promise in every direction. Elliot stood by Micah's side as best man. He had offered to pay for everything, but Micah insisted they split the cost. "I'm not the mechanic anymore," he said, "but I'm still me." Elliot smiled. "I wouldn't want you any other way." The night before the wedding, at the rehearsal dinner in a terraced garden overlooking the coast, Lena approached Micah with a small time-worn envelope. "I found this," she said, voice shaking a little, "in a box I hadn't touched since Clara's funeral. I think it was meant for this moment." Micah took it slowly. His name was written on the front in Clara's looping script, the ink faded but still clear. He opened it after everyone had been served their wine. The table quieted as he stood letter in hand, his voice soft but unwavering. "I'd like to read something," he said, "from my mother." The first line alone brought a hush to the air. "My dearest Micah, if you're reading this, it means you found your way not just through life but back to him. And for that, I'm already so proud of you." The letter wasn't long, just a page, but every word felt soaked in meaning. "I was scared when I had you, not of being a mother. I knew I could do that. but of losing myself, of losing him, of becoming someone who depended too much on a person who never asked for the wait. I didn't tell him about you not because he was unworthy, but because I thought I was." Micah's voice cracked. "I thought by leaving I was sparing you both. But I realize now that love doesn't always need to be perfect to be real, and real love finds its way home. Always." There were tears, quiet, unashamed. Elliot looked down at his lap hands, trembling, then back at his son, who now stood not as a boy, born in silence, but as a man forged in truth. Micah folded the letter carefully and held it against his chest. "I used to think my story was about being abandoned," he said. "But it's not. It's about being loved in complicated, imperfect, sometimes heartbreaking ways, but loved all the same." He raised a glass. "To the ones who left us, to the ones we found, to the ones we choose." The toasts that followed were full of laughter and memory, but that letter, that moment, was the quiet heartbeat that carried them all through the night. The next day, Micah and Ella were married beneath a canopy of olive branches and white roses. During the vows, Ella took Micah's hand and whispered, "You don't have to carry the past alone anymore." And Micah, through tears, whispered back, "I'm not. He's here." At the reception, Elliot gave a speech. It wasn't rehearsed. It was just honest. "I spent most of my life building things, buildings, businesses, but this is what I'm proudest of. This table, this family, this second chance." And then he paused, lifted his glass toward his son and said, "Micah Granger." Because Micah had chosen that very morning to take his father's name not out of obligation, but because he finally understood that legacy isn't what we inherit, it's what we build. The final scene was quiet. Back in Seattle, months later, Elliot sat at the Clara Granger Foundation's annual scholarship gala, watching as the first 10 recipients, young mothers with hope in their eyes, took the stage. Micah was beside him, hand resting gently on his daughter's stroller. They named her Clara, not as a tribute, but as a beginning. That night, Elliot wrote a note he tucked into the first page of his granddaughter's baby book. "One day, you'll hear stories about your grandmother, about how she left, about how she loved, about how she changed the course of everything without ever being in the room. And when you hear those stories, I want you to remember your name isn't just hers. It's a promise that no matter how far apart we start, we always find our way back to each other." Micah never saw the note, but he didn't need to, because when his daughter smiled up at him for the first time, eyes just like Clara's he already knew. Some stories don't end, they echo. Through weddings, through letters, through the small ordinary moments, we build into legacies that last. Sometimes life doesn't fall apart all at once. Sometimes it unravels quietly through years of silence, choices never explained, love withheld, not from cruelty, but from fear. And then sometimes, just when you think it's too late to rebuild, something unexpected happens. A letter resurfaces. A voice returns. A door opens, and you're reminded that the heart has a longer memory than time. Elliot Granger was a man who had it all: power, success, a skyline shaped in his image. But for years he lived with an emptiness he couldn't name until the day he found Micah standing at Clara's grave. That moment didn't just reintroduce him to a son. It redefined everything he thought he knew about love, legacy, and what it means to be a father. Clara, the woman who once held both Elliot's heart and their child's future, chose a path marked by solitude, not out of weakness, but from a strength most people wouldn't understand. She lived with her decision every day, raising Micah with quiet resilience, never letting on how heavy her silence had become. She gave him love, wisdom, and dignity, even as her body weakened. And in the end, her words, captured in a forgotten letter, became the bridge that connected two broken men and healed a generational wound. Micah, shaped by abandonment and survival, grew up learning not to expect much from the world. But what he never lost was his sense of self. He refused to be pitied. He wouldn't be bought. What he wanted, what he needed, was honesty, consistency, and someone to show up not with apologies but with presence. And when Elliot did show up, first in grief, then in devotion, Micah didn't forgive him immediately. He made him earn it, through hospital visits, through shared meals, through the long, uncomfortable work of building trust. And Elliot did. Not with grand gestures, but with small, faithful ones, one by one. In the end, their story wasn't about perfect reunions or clean resolutions. It was about choosing to love anyway, to stay, to listen, to make space for grief and for growth sometimes in the same breath. It was about realizing that family isn't just blood, it's who shows up when it matters most. Clara never got to see the legacy she left behind, but it lived on in the foundation that now bears her name and the scholarship that helps young mothers dream again in the eyes of her granddaughter, who now carries her name into the future. And maybe that's the truest kind of legacy, not the buildings we leave behind, but the relationships we fight to restore, the forgiveness we learn to offer, the second chances we dare to accept. So, what can we take from this story? First, that people are more than the choices they made in pain. Clara made the best decision she could given what she knew and feared. Elliot didn't chase her because he thought he'd already lost her. And Micah, he carried that silence until he could transform it into strength. From all of them, we learned that the past doesn't define us. What matters is what we do with what we know now. Second healing isn't always loud. It's not always cinematic. Sometimes it's sitting beside someone who hurt you, not to relive the pain, but to build something new from the pieces. And that takes grace, patience, humility, the kind of courage that whispers we can start again, even when everything inside you says, run. And finally, remember this: there is always room at the table, for conversations long overdue, for connections thought lost, for love that took the scenic route but found its way home. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you've lost or someone you still have a chance to find, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful, true-to-life stories like this one. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter, the ones that remind us we're all just trying to find our way back to each other. Thank you for watching. And until next time, may you love, fully forgive, freely, and never underestimate the power of showing up.